In this video, I am going to continue where we left off on Job's or Elihu's first speech to Job, and how Elihu is seeking to give his, can I say, response to the situation with Job. So we are now at chapter 33, verse 12. And what I will do, I'll read the Hebrew, give it an English translation, and then we'll look at a commentary verse by verse. So as we look at chapter 13, chapter 33, Elihu has requested Job's attention to his speech. He has objected to Job's challenging God with his innocency as he sets forth God's mysterious ways now of speaking to man. In this first speech, he tries to explain God's manner of communicating with man and how that is not always the way we as humans would anticipate. So we stop at verse 12. We'll pick up there, and it reads, Hein zot lo tzadakta anecha. Lo, I answer you, in this you have not made yourself correct, or you have not justified yourself. Ki yirbe Eloah me anosh. For God is greater than man, or too great for man. Job has erred in his reasoning, thinking that he can reason like he does, not realizing that God is above all arbitrary hostility. That comes from man's effort to criticize his divine actions. And we're not able to criticize God's actions. We can't understand them, is, I think, Elihu's point. So in verse 13, he continues, Madua elav ribota. Why have you striven against him? Ki hol devarav lo ya'aneh. For he will not answer any of his words. For all, literally, of his words, he will not answer. God, being the great one that he is, will not answer you, Job, as expected, is the way that Elihu is reasoning. And so verse 14, Ki va'achat yedaber el, for God speaks in one way. Uv'shtayim lo yeshurena. Indeed, in two, though man cannot perceive it or really understand it. So what Elihu is saying now is that God, although unseen, speaks in ways to make his presence realized. It may be through dreams by which God speaks. And we'll see this in verse 15. Or again, through trials in verses 17 and following. So he's showing how God speaks, even though we as humans cannot fully perceive it or understand it like we would think we would like to sometimes. So in verse 15, Bahalom Hezion Lila, in a dream, in the vision of the night, Benfo Tardema al Anashim, when Tardema, deep sleep, falls upon men. Bitnumot alai mishkav, in slumberings upon the bed. And what Elihu is saying here, Elihu has in mind probably Eliphaz's vision in chapter 4, verse 13, and Job's nightmares in chapter 7, verse 14. Dreams and visions are among the ways in which God speaks to men. And this is seen throughout Scripture, for example, in Genesis 20, verse 3, in Joel 2, verse 28, and in Acts chapter 2, verse 17. Often God will speak through dreams. Then in verse 16, he continued, Az yigleh ozen anashim. Then he opens the ears of men to reveal to them. He reveals to them. And uvemosaram yaktom. And by their, or in their chastisement, he seals the decree. He seals what he wants to share. So in verse 16, the thought then is God sometimes speaks to man by ways of chastisement, by which he seals or completes his decree in removing man's human pride, which continues on then in verse 17. Lehasir Adam ma'aseh, that men may put away their thought or their doing. V'neva megever yechaseh, that pride from man he may hide, that he may cover or hide pride from man. And so Elihu continues, God causes men to change their plans. Elihu alludes back to Job's words in chapter 17, verse 11. Pride is a dangerous trap. We see this in verse 18, which God keeps men from falling into. At times, it takes the lesson he is arguing of suffering for one to humble himself to the point where he willingly places himself in the hand of God. And so as he continues in verse 18, he then writes or says, Yaksok nafsho mani shachat, that he may keep his soul from the pit, that he may guard his soul from the pit. V'chayato me'avor ba'shalach, and his life from being destroyed by the sword, or from passing away by the sword. And so another possible, by the way, translation of pit here could mean grave. It refers to a violent death, which is a symbol of the future punishment reserved for the ungodly. God's chastisements are designed to keep the godly from this future punishment. And as he continues then in verse 19, V'huchach b'machov al mishkavo, he is chastened with pain upon his bed. V'riv atzamav etam, and all of his bones grow stiff. And what he seems to be speaking of here is that God speaks to man, chastening him with various forms of illness and other affliction. Elihu later suggests that affliction serves to discipline the godly. In 36 verse 10, he is chastened on his bed in the prime of life, perhaps while his bones are firm. Verse 20 then, he continues, V'zihamatu hayato lachem, so that his life causes him to abhor to abhor bread. His life causes him to abhor bread, food. V'nafsho ma'achal ta'ava, and that is his soul to abhor dainty food. And so, being so afflicted, the sick person loses all taste for food. And we've all experienced that when we're not well, that we don't have the hunger for food that we would normally have. And then in verse 21, Elihu continues, Yehel besaro merohi, his flesh is consumed from seeing, that it cannot be seen, or from seeing. Veshufi atzmotav lo ru'u. And so he continues, and his bones corrode to that which is not able to be seen, that which is unsightly, so to speak. And so what he's saying in 21, as we continue, the sick person then, so afflicted, wastes away, and his bones can be seen through the skin, becoming unsightly. And so we continue in verses 23 and 24, where Elihu speaks of a messenger who comes to the afflicted person and declares to him his discipline in affliction and God's righteousness in the suffering that he's going through. So in verse 23, it continues then, Im yesh shalav mal'ach, if there be for him a messenger, malitz achad mini aleph, one who is an intercessor, one among 1,000, lehagid la'adam yoshro, to declare to man his uprightness. In other words, what he's saying is, God will send a messenger to the afflicted person and declare to him his discipline in affliction and God's righteousness in the suffering. He will then plead for his deliverance from death and speaks of a ransom which the redeemed, the afflicted man, or which will redeem the afflicted man, or has redeemed him. Due to the intercessor's intercession, God pardons and relieves the sufferer. So in 24, it reads then, Vayahunenu vayomer, and he is gracious unto him and says, Peda'ehu meredet shachat, That is, deliver him, rescue him from going down unto the pit. I have found a ransom, Matsati Hofer. And so again, due to the intercessor's intercession, God now is going to pardon and deliver the sufferer. For the intercessor speaks of a ransom which has ransomed the afflicted man. And in 25, his flesh, ratafash besaro minar. His flesh is more tender than a child's. Yashuv leme alumav. He returns to the days of his youth. And what the text seems to be saying here, the afflicted one will then have his flesh restored to that of a healthy childhood. It will be a similar experience as that which happened, for example, to Naaman the leper when he was delivered from leprosy. So God is using discipline to deliver and to help one and to teach one, is Elihu's argument. So in 26, the text continues, Yetar el Eloha vayirtsehu. He intercedes for unto God, or prays unto God, and he is favorable to him. Vayar panav bitru'ah. And he sees his face with joy. Vayashiv la anosh tzidkato. And then he gives back or restores to man his righteousness. In other words, what he's saying here is that Job will no longer pray to God in vain, as he complained in chapter 23, for example, verses 8 and 9. God will not hide his face from the afflicted and turn away from helping him. See chapter 13, verse 24, where that is brought out. Instead, though, he is admitted into the presence of God and experiences direct fellowship with him. And so Elihu then continues in verse 27. He comes before man and says, Yashar al anashim vayomer, I have sinned, hatati, vayashar echaveti. I have sinned and perverted that which was right, or that which is right. I have wrongly used or perverted. Velo shava li, and it did not profit me at all in any way. And the delivered person would then come before men and testify of God's deliverance. He would admit his sin and perverting of righteousness, and he would publicly acknowledge God's redemption of his soul, especially from death, to continue to experience the light of life and living in contrast to the darkness of the grave. So Elihu is focusing upon discipline and going through things as a means of, such as chastening and chastisement, as a means of making one better, seems to be his argument. And then verse 29. Verse 27. He comes before men, and notice what he says: I have sinned and perverted that which was right, and it did not profit me. And then in 28, Pada nafshi ma'avor bashachat. So he redeems his soul from going down into the pit. V'chayato ba'or tir'er. And his life from and his life in seeing the light, that it might look into the light. And so God often works with man in the means just described, he's arguing, in verses 8 to 20, with chastisement, intercession, and deliverance. And all of this is to teach man and ultimately to deliver him from the grave. And that he continues then in the next verse or two. Notice 29. Hein ko ela yif'al el. All these things God does. Pe'amayim shalosh im gaver. Indeed, twice, 3 times with a man to bring back his soul from the pit. Lahashiv nafsho mini shachat. In other words, he does this to bring back his life from the pit, from destruction. Le'ur ba'ur a-chayim. That he might be enlightened with the light of the living ones. And so in verse 30, his point is what man has gone through in this time of suffering ultimately is to lead to man's deliverance from the grave, that he may experience genuine life and the light with the living. And so we move on to verses 31 to 33 as Elihu continues. Hakshev oyev shemali. Mark well, O Job, and listen to me. Hacharesh ve'anochi adaber. Hold, like hold your peace, or be still, and I will speak. Verse 32. Im yesh milin hashiveni. If there is then anything to say, or any words, if there are words, then answer me. Daber, speak. Ki hafatzti tzadkatcha. Tzadkecha. That is, speak, for I desire to really justify you. If not, though, im ayin ata shema li. If not, then you listen to me. Hacharesh va'alefcha hokma. Hold your peace, and I then will really show you and teach you wisdom. And so what we have here actually in 31 to 33 is Elihu is concluding his first speech with an exhortation to Job to listen to him. If he must speak, he encourages Job to do so, realizing that he, unlike his other friends, desires to justify Job. But above all, if Job will be silent, he boasts that he will teach Job true wisdom about his suffering. And that's the first speech of Job, or of Elihu, And as we move to 34, then we'll go to the second speech of Elihu. And the whole emphasis here seems to be that God is using suffering as a means of discipline to help Job become better and to avoid death, to avoid the pit, so to speak. And that seems to be a summary of the argument of Elihu in this first speech.